Hey everyone, Gabriel Nassif aka Yellowhat, and today I'm going to be doing a deck guide on a list that I've had a ton of success with. I went 30-6 over 4 leagues and 2 modern challenges. That's over an 80% win rate. And they included a 6-2 run in the Saturday challenge, a 6-1 run into a quarterfinal loss in the Sunday challenge. I've played against most major archetypes, I believe, and I'll obviously have a little sideboard guide. I've got the notepad, the busted notepad here to help me out. So I'm gonna go through the deck, the concept, the cards, and then try to get into the major matchups as well as how it's sideboard in all of these matchups. So if that's kind of content you want to see more of, deck guides on major archetypes or decks I've done well with, uh, make sure you let me know in the comments what I can do better, what you might be interested in. So the deck, Omnath Control, I got the list from House of Mana MTG, who played it to 2-4-0 finishes in prelims on Magic Online. I believe it was kind of, the list came from 2 other players, Leviathan and Bullwinkle, I believe their screen names are. So that's not my original list. I've played Omnath deck in the past, and there's a ton of Omnath variants, many ways to build a deck, but you're going to find a lot of the same cards. It's kind of the details that varies. And this one is kind of a tap-out deck. You're basically playing all the busted Planeswalker, Ren and 6, Teferi Time Raveler, Jace, and 5 mana Teferi. You're playing Omnath, and to complement your tap-out strat, you're going to use the free spells, whether it's Force of Negations or Solitude, as well as Fury. You're going to use, Catch-all, Prismatic Ending, and you have Counterspell as well, which acts as turn 2 interaction, early game interaction, as well as kind of late game answers to make sure you have the game locked up. Obviously, nice combo is a Teferi +2. So that's kind of the core concept. You get some versions of Omnath Control that were trying to play a more control-ish style was Archmage's Charm, counter spells, more instant speed card draw and whatnot, and interaction. This is really just jam, powerful card every turn, hope something sticks, hope you just outpower your opponent and not fall too far behind using cards like Solitude, Force of Negation. And you of course have Expressive Iteration, which is one of the best cards printed in the past few years, just dominates every format, standard, historic, modern, I'm assuming Pioneer too, and I believe it sees plays in Legacy and Vintage as well, but don't quote me on that. So yeah, that's kind of the concept. Just tap out, play a powerful spell, try to snowball with your Planeswalker, and win the game. Cards I haven't talked about are Supreme Verdict, just cards really good right now in Modern. Most of the good decks are creature decks, and Verdict's really good against a deck like Izzet Murktide, can't be countered, reliable answer. It's also nice that it pitches to both Force of Negation and Solitude. All the gold cards go up in value. I don't think, for instance, Teferi Hero of the Mare especially great in the deck, but the fact that you can pitch it to both Force and Solitude is a nice bonus. I'm going to take a look at the mana base. You've got one of each basics. The mana base is pretty tight, 24 lands. You can't really play less, and I think you need definitely at least one of each basic, non-mountain basic. That's because of Blood Moon. The reason you need basics is A, not to take too much damage every time you fetch a land, and B, be able to keep casting spells against Blood Moon. I see Blood Moon gives you Mountain, so you don't really need basic Mountain as much as you need the 3 others. You have one of each of the Shocklands, no skimping. I believe that's correct. I think you kind of need them all. You also need a critical mass of fetchable lands because your games go late and you don't want to run out of lands to fetch too early, whether it's because you need the mana or because you want to be able to keep triggering Omnath. You, on top of that, have 12 fetch lands, which is, once again, you need critical mass. You need critical mass for Ren so you can play Ren on 2 and have a fetch land to bring back. I think 12 is a good amount. You're also playing a 4-color deck, so you need as many dual lands and fetch lands as you can get. You just can't afford to play, I don't know, second basic islands, or maybe card like Hull of the Storm Giant is tempting, a man land, but it all has a cost, and I've been pretty happy with the mana the way it is. So the 12 fetch lands, you prioritize Flooded Strand and Misty Rainforest for, I guess, extra blue. You also have a couple Scalding Tarns as well as 2 Windswept Heath. You could maybe play 4 Scalding Tarns, but I want to be able to have more ways to fetch basic forest and basic plains. So mana has been really good for me. You, of course, have 2 of the 2 Triumphs. I say, of course, even though there's been some Omnath variants that don't play the Triumphs, the ones that have a lot of 1 mana cards. But I think in this deck it makes sense. You don't have a ton of 1 mana spells, as well as the 1 Lonely Sandbar. That card's been really strong for me. The extra cycling land was Ren is huge. It definitely, the difference between winning and losing, it obviously has a cost. It means you can't fetch a Triumph on turn 1 if you want to cycle it on turn 1, or if you do, you need to shock, maybe to take that 2 extra damage. But I would like to be able to play a second one. If I was going to add a 25th land, it would almost definitely be a second Lonely Sandbar. All right, that was the mana, that was the cards. The list you see here is the list I played in the 2 challenges. I would make some changes. I'll get into it. I guess I can get into it right now. I think I would almost definitely play the Forced Iteration. So a lot of people see this list and they're like, oh, it's a little clunky, it's a little slow, you don't have time for iteration. But I think at the end of the day, iteration is way too powerful, way too good of a magic card, way above the curve, and I think you just want to play 4. It also pitches to Force of Negation and Fury. And I found myself wishing pretty much every game, every match, I wish I could draw more iteration. I think the weakest cards in the deck are the second Teferi Hero of Dominaria, the Fury, that has been good for me, but probably a little questionable, the second Jace the Mind Sculpture, the Force Teferi Time Raveler, third Force of Negation, Force Counterspell, and the Force Ren. A lot of people only play free Ren. The original list actually had 4 iterations and free Ren, but it's a card you just always want in your opening hand. It's so powerful on 2. It kills Ragavan, it kills Chandler most of the time, and it helps you in the spots where you have to mulligan. It also just takes over. Even if you played on turn 2, get back a land, and the deal with it was an ending or an Unholy Heat. You're up a card. It makes sure you don't miss your land drops. Obviously, you do flood sometimes, and it's not the greatest top deck in the mid game. It can be a little slow in the mid game as a top deck, and you always have the cycling land and graveyard. So I could see cutting a Ren, but it always feels so bad when you don't have it in your opening hand. The deck's also pretty good at protecting Ren. Your Ren plus, you solitude a creature or force on negation a spell maybe, and you get to untap with it, and the game feels so much better. So these are the cards that are, if you want to mess around, tinker with the list, these are all the cards you can trim. And I think it would be about in that order. Maybe Force of Negation is a bit too important, just because you're tapping out a lot, and you need to. That's how you out tempo them. You play a spell on your turn, play a spell for free on their turn, and pull ahead. As far as other cards I might try, Lightning Bolt is tempting. The deck doesn't deal very well with a Dash Ragavan, but the Lightning Bolt gets all awkward with the Chalices of the Void after sideboard, and I've been mostly getting away, even though it is annoying to get hit by Ragavan. A lot of the time you're able to fight through it. Or Solitude, or Teferi Time Raveler Plus into an instant split prismatic ending. So you have a few answers. But yeah, a Lightning Bolt or 2 could definitely be interesting as far as main deck goes. So I guess I'll talk about the sideboard cards as we go through the sideboard guide, and I'm gonna get into matchups now and talk a bit about each matchup and how it's sideboards. So that happened against Murktide. So blue-red Murktide, I think, might just be the best deck in the format overall. If I had been trying to win this past weekend at all costs, I think I would have registered blue-red Murktide. But after doing so well in leagues, I was 80-2 in my 4 leagues I played with the deck. I felt like I wanted to give this deck a chance in the challenge, and I'm glad I did. I think other people had success with the deck as well. I think in the Sunday challenge, there was at least 2 other players who made top 8 was a very similar list, or maybe even 3. But yeah, deck had a great showing. And I played against Murktide a bunch. I had some good sets. I actually lost to it in the quarterfinals on Sunday. I made a huge blunder in game 1 and kind of got crushed in game 2. My opponents actually played 5 iterations to my 0. They drew all 4 of their iterations, and they got 1 of Ragavan, so that did not feel very good. But overall, I did okay on Saturday. I played against Murktide twice and beat it 2-0 twice. So I think the matchup is close. I'm going to be saying that about a lot of matchups. And yeah, Counterspell is pretty key here. It lets you fight on their turn. If they're trying to cast a Murktide, you get to counter. If they want to counter back, it usually means you get to untap and maybe play a Teferi Time Raveler or Jace, etc., bounce their Murktide. You've got your iterations. They're basically there to match their iterations. And that's one of the reasons I will want 4. It's good in it's good in that matchup. You kind of need to go toe for toe, and it's also good against some of the discard decks. I actually, both my losses in the Saturday challenge came against black-red decks. One was Ragdos Lurrus, the other one was Grixis Lurrus Shadow. So having iteration number 4 there would be nice. Rain 6 really strong against them. It pings the cheap creatures, and it also helps you make land drops if they're just being passive and they don't have a very fast run. You have Ren 6 sticking up. It's going to play out a bit like a control matchup. So that card was strong. That was one of the reasons I was really upset in that game 1. Basically what happened is that I was on the play. I got turn 2 Ren pinging down their turn 1 Chandler, and I got to untap with Ren, and for some reason decided to counter Petty Theft, targeting my Ren, which meant they got to untap, cast a Serum Vision, cast a Murktide, which had no answer to, and the Murktide kind of ran away with the game. They backed it up with a bunch of counter spells, so it was pretty big blunder. I didn't need to really fight over that Ren. I could just cast it again a turn or 2 later. I even had a second copy if they countered my Ren, so I was a little upset at myself. You get Force of Negation, not the greatest card. They're not casting a ton of spells you're going to want to force in game 1 especially. You're usually not going to want to force an iteration. It's also not the greatest card against Spell Pierce, so maybe you just save them for later in the game as a hard counter. Maybe on turn 6 you go to Fairy Time Raveler plus Force of Negation back up to deal with a Murktide, for instance. You've got Verdict. Verdict's great card game 1. They don't have any counterplay to it, so what Verdict does is that it lets you tap out pretty aggressively and not be too scared about Murktide, which is nice. And yeah, basically you're just playing like, I guess, a control deck or a mid-range deck. I'm not too sure how to necessarily describe the matchup. It's not something that you can go over in a few minutes, but it's just about, as always, it's a bit vague to say that, but just good sequencing, always try to, make sure you're kind of trying to use your mana efficiently. Make sure you're trying to slowly get ahead, prolong the game, and you should be okay in the late game, even though with their low land counts and cards like Iteration, Serum Visions, and Charm, they also have a lot of card advantage. Your cards are a little more powerful, and the matchup, honestly, it feels like it comes down to whether or not they have a very good start or not. It feels like if they don't have the good draw, was a 1-draw backed up by maybe a Spell Pierce or whatnot, you're going to be in good shape. If they do have that draw, it might be a little trickier. One advice I would give you in general with this deck is to use Solitude very liberally. 2 for 1 yourself, get rid of that cheap creature. You'll make up for it later in the game. So that's definitely one tip I can give you. As far as sideboard goes, it's not clear cut. It's what I've been doing, and I feel like it's been working. So what I do is I board out the Force of Negations, even though it's a little tricky because they do bring in Blood Moon and Jace, which are spells you definitely need to fight over in game 2. So it's tough because you kind of want them, but they're also pretty bad against their Spell Pierce and Flusterstorm, and I don't know if you can really afford to 2 for 1 yourself in this matchup. So what I do is I board out 3 Force of Negation, 2 Verdict, 1 Jace, 1 Teferi, kind of make the deck a bit leaner, and I bring in the 1 Celestial Purge for Blood Moon and their red permanents. And I bring in the 2 Disputes to fight over Jace and Iteration, their own Counterspell and Murktide. I bring 3 Endurance, and I bring 2 Chalice of the Void, which I feel like is your best way of winning the sideboard games, just sticking a Chalice for 1 and just gaining advantage with it over the course of the game. My quarterfinals opponent actually brought in Explosives, which was kind of smart. It gives you an answer to Chalice, as well as potentially gets rid of a Ren and 6 that So yeah, sideboard games are much trickier. You do get some good cards, but they do as well. They usually get 2 Blood Moons, 2 Jace, and more cheap counter spells, whether it's Dispute, Flusterstorm, or maybe an extra Spell Pierce. So yeah, you have to keep that in mind at all times. And I don't have a great answer. It's something I'm not very good at, is factoring Blood Moon, because anytime you search basics instead of dual lands, you're potentially costing you a spell down the line. And I've definitely lost a lot of games where I searched basics, scared of Blood Moon, and ended up costing me the game because I didn't have that extra blue to cast a Dispute, or card like Veil of Summer. So definitely beware. It's also awkward because you're bringing in Endurance. So yeah, that's for the blue-red Murktide deck. I'm probably gonna go a bit faster for the other matchups, but I feel like Murktide's one of the most popular deck and best deck. And yeah, tough matchup, close matchup. I'm not exactly sure who's favored. Not exactly sure if you should board out all your forces, should board out all your verdicts. But I feel like the reason verdict's not as good in the sideboard games is because if you tap out for verdict, they can tap out for a Jace or a Blood Moon, and you might just lose the game on the spot. Against Hammer Time, I think Hammer Time's a good matchup. Your cards just line up pretty good against them. You have answers to everything they do. And this list came ready with the sideboard. It has a bunch of Force of Vigors. So what I do there, I will obviously post a link to the sideboard guide in the description, so don't worry about that. But yeah, against Hammer Time, what I do is I bring in Fury, I bring in Force of Vigor, I bring in the 2 Chalice, I bring in 2 Spreading Seas for Urza Saga and the Ink Moss, and I bring in just 1 Endurance. It's not amazing against them, but it can get them, and it kind of lowers their curve. And then what I do is I cut Force of Negation. Force of Negation is kind of okay against them. It's tricky to play because if you Force of Negation a Sigarda's Aid and they have a second one, it feels really bad. If you let Sigarda's Aid resolve and then they just play turn 2 Stoneforge Mystic, all of a sudden you can't force the hammer anymore. So it's kind of a gamble. And the thing is, Force of Negation is nice if maybe you're a blue-white control deck and you're a bit slower, but this deck has other cheap and free spells. You have the Solitudes, you have the Furies, and you have the Force of Vigors, which has their Force of Vigor is basically a much better Force of Negation, so you don't need them as badly after sideboard. So board all those out. I board out 2 counter spells because it can be a little awkward. I board out 1 Wrenn and 6, even though it does ping some of their creatures. I don't think you need it as badly because they're not super good at grinding, and you can get away without a turn 2 Wrenn to carry you. Also board out a 5-mana Teferi, kind of just an expensive spell, as well as 2 free-mana Teferi, which might be a bit surprising and could be wrong. The logic is all their permanents are really cheap, and Teferi Time Raveler gets a bit worse when you're always bouncing a 1 or 2 mana spell, even though I guess they have Lurrus. So that's the reasoning. But Teferi Time Raveler can also be really strong. Was the passive, the +2, letting you play Prismatic Ending at instant speed can be big. So I could see just trimming maybe a Jason Mind Sculpture, keep it for Teferi. Keep in mind that they sometimes bring in Pithing Needle, and they can get that card with Urza's Saga, so be careful with your fetch lands. As well as, I guess, just be careful which fetch lands you play in general against someone who might have Needle. If you have 2 of the same fetch land in hand, play that one first. You know, you never know. But yeah, keep in mind that with Saga they can get Pithing Needle. The other ones are more straightforward. You know, it's usually Hammer in that matchup. They're not going to have Graveyard Hate. So don't get got, and that's one of the reasons why I don't want to have all 4 Teferi Time Ravelers, because if they Needle, that's usually the card they're going to Needle, and you draw multiple, you're in trouble. Same for Wrenn and 6. I think that sideboard plan is really solid, and you know, I just think this is just pretty decent matchup. There's some tricky decisions, especially whether or not you should play into Esper Sentinel. I think this is really hand dependent. I've definitely had games where I made sure I didn't give them a single card of the Esper Sentinel, and I've had other games where I just let them draw a card on turn 2 and then a card on turn 3. You know, I played a counter spell into it on turn 2. They drew a card. I played the Fairy Time Raveler on turn 3. They got to draw a card, and I thought it was correct to do so. So, yeah. All right, next, against Blue-White Control. Blue-White Control so far has been good. I wasn't sure how the matchup would go. I was a little worried, and I actually got to play in the Saturday challenge. I got paired against Guillaume Wafotapa round 1, beat him 2-0. I got paired against his friend Mr. Cafriet round 2, also beat him 2-0. The matchup played out okay. You basically just you know, jam. You have pretty much all Fred Zaff counter, so you jam, you hope something sticks. And the advantage you have right now against the list most people play is that you have Force of Negation and they don't. So you can tap out for a Time Raveler, they're going to counter it, but they don't have the same luxury because they can be punished if they tap out for a Planeswalker. You force it, untap, resolve with Jace, and that might just be the game. You also have ending for 4 Frontier Chase. I guess they do too now. Most blue-white lists are going to play that Breeding Pool or that Watery Grave to get to 4. But yeah, all your cards main deck are pretty strong, honestly. Solitude, I mean, I guess they have their Solitude. You have your Solitude. A card like Fury has been good for me. But yeah, if you look at the deck, what's so nice about it is that you have no dead cards against blue-white. The only dead card is Supreme Verdict, and even that can sometimes come in handy. You know, the endings deal was their Teferi or their Shark tokens, and yeah, it's just about jamming Freds, hoping a Wrenn and 6 sticks. You know, if you're on the play and you go turn 2 Wrenn and 6, they're usually not gonna have a counterspell, and that alone can get you a ton of tempo. If they tap out to kill it with an ending, maybe you get to resolve it to Fairy Time Raveler. So I think until Blue-White Control starts playing Force of Negation again, you're in good shape there. But yeah, I was surprised, honestly. The one thing I will say, if you play on Magic Online, one of the most important things is how fast you play. I almost timed out against Walfo, and the second match was a bit faster, but definitely keep that in mind. If it almost felt like it was the most important things in that match is to play fast. It's kind of reminiscent of some of the old Uro versus Uro matchups. All right, sideboard strat against them. Pretty straightforward. I board out 2 verdicts and board out 4 endings. I bring in my cards that do something, aka the 2 disputes, the 1 fury, and the 3 endurance. Not really cards that you would think, dedicated cards against control, but you're just boarding out the dead cards. Ending does something, but the logic is I'd rather have as many cards as possible in my deck be proactive threats. So endurance and fury over prismatic ending. And yeah, endurance is not super easy for them to deal with. The instant speed threat might you're basically trying to get a point. Maybe you play end after endurance. If they don't counter it, good, you have a clock. If they do, then you get to untap and maybe go Teferi plus counterspell or something. So yeah, I've beaten Blue White twice, and I actually saw Waffle lose to that deck too in his semifinals on Sunday. So I'm not sure how representative it is. I'm also not sure what happens if they start playing more Force of Negations or maybe more disputes over the Dovin's Veto and have cheaper cards be able to themselves play two spells in a turn, like counter your spell as dispute, end of turn deluge, that kind of patterns. Or if they start playing Force of Negation again, all of a sudden they get to tap outs for their Planeswalker. One card I'm not playing in my sideboard in that you might want is Veil of Summer. I started with 2, and that card kept being awkward for me against Murktide, and I ended up cutting it. It was also a little awkward with Chalice of the Void, but that's definitely a matchup where it would shine. That would be against Blue-White Control. Next is Living End. Living End is pretty tricky game 1. If you're on the draw, you don't get to tap out without Ren. Ideally you're on the play, you stick a turn to Ren, and then you kind of sit on Ren. Maybe you have a counter spell or 2. Maybe you get to tap out for Teferi on turn 3. Just you have the tools to beat them, but they also have Griefs and Force of Negation to just snag your cards. And even though on paper it looks like the matchup should be great because you're playing Force of Negation and Counterspell and 4 Teferi Time Raveler, and then even if they resolve Living In, you still have a Verdict. You have the Solitude trick where they're living in and you Solitude in response. It evokes, goes in the yard, comes back, kills a creature. You have, just the games where if they don't get a great Living End, you just go Omnath, gain 4, play, Solitude, and they can't, all of a sudden, they just can't even race you anymore. So you've got a lot of good things going for you. But as someone who's played a lot of Living In, I can tell you that even if it looks good on paper and it feels like it should be good, Living In is an incredibly powerful deck, and they can just not draw you. If they just have a Grief into a Subtlety, or a Grief into a Force of Negation and a Living In, and you're like, wow, I had my good hand. I had turn to Ren, I had a Teferi Time Raveler in hand, I even had a Force of Negation, and it just didn't even matter. So I think it's still favorable. The sideboard games get even better. You get 2 Chalice of the Void, you get 3 Endurance, you get 2 Disputes, mostly to fight their cards, their Force of Negations or their Subtleties. Be aware they're going to have Subtlety for your Endurance. So usually there's not much you're going to be able to do about it if they have the nuts. But if you can, keep Subtlety in mind in the sideboard games. Sideboarding, once again, pretty straightforward. 4 prismatic ending. Cards just pretty much doesn't do anything against them. 2 5-mana Teferi and 1 Fury. Fury, I don't think does enough to fight their Living Ends. And you cut 5-mana Teferi about Jace just because it's 1 mana more expensive, and Jace digs deeper. digs deeper to your free cards like Endurance and Force of Negation. So Jace gets the nod there. Obviously, Teferi is white, so you can pitch it to Solitude, but I think Jace is better there. So yeah, board out these 7 cards, bring in the 2 Chalice of Free Endurance and the 2 Disputes. Keep in mind they're going to have Solitude after sideboard. Keep in mind they have a few answers to Chalice, whether it's the Evoke Creatures or Brazen Boar. But yeah, I think this is still quite favorable matchup as long as you have the Chalice in the sideboard. Burn's matchup I played a few times. I think in general, these Teferi, Time Raveler, Solitude deck, whether it's Blue-White Control or this deck, are going to be pretty decent against Burn. This deck, you deal yourself a lot of damage with the lands, but you have Omnath. You're basically kind of trying to survive to an Omnath is how you win a lot of games against Burn. Yeah, once again, you know, use your Solitudes right away. I'm not too sure what tips I can really give you for this matchup. I guess don't keep bad hands, don't keep hands that don't. So against Burn, the sideboard plan is you want to bring in. Oh, so Burn's one of the few matchups where the sideboard plan is a little different. When you're on the play, you want to bring in the Purge, the 2 Spreading Seas, which is a card that I think is good on the draw on the play. You stop them from playing an Eidolon on 2, but not as appealing on the draw. So yeah, against Burn, +2 Spreading Seas, +2 Chalice on the play, +1 Purge, and potentially some Endurance or Fury. I'm not 100% about the Burn matchup. That was actually one of my losses in one of the challenges, but I also beat the deck I think once or twice before that. And what I decided to try in this matchup is one Ren. I trim Ren, I trim 5 mana Teferi, I trim some Jace, you can trim a Force of Negation. So yeah, changes a bit on the play on the draw. But that one's not super set in stone. I guess the main question is how many Furies you want. You want to bring in the second one, and how many Endurance you want. That's one of the tricky things in general when you sideboard against Burn as a control player is how many answers you want to their creatures and how many answers you want to their Burn spells, you know, how many counter spells you want to put in. It's the same thing with Blue-White Control, you know, how many Verdicts you keep in, how many spot removals you keep in. It's not easy, and it's, you know, disadvantage of playing a reactive deck. One card you could play in the sideboard. I think if I was going to have if your local meta is full of Burn decks for some reason, or maybe if you played against a lot of Magic Online because it's one of the cheaper decks to build, I think Sunset Revelry would be a consideration. I'm also partial to Weather the Storm. I think that card's pretty cool against Burn, but I've heard good things of Sunset Revelry. Next up, we have the Mill matchup. You have the answers. You need a good draw. I've beaten Mill so far, but it's felt really close. You have the answers you need, and you have an okay game plan against it. You also have decent sideboard options. Dispute, 2 Dispute, 3 Endurance, 2 Chalice, and there you just board out the 2 Verdicts. I think Verdict's a bit too slow for their creatures. Board out 1 5 mana Teferi just because it's expensive and just one of the worst cards in the deck in general. You board out the Fury, just not good enough of a removal. Board out 2 Solitudes because you're bringing other kinds of removal, and you have Endurance to reset. You also have Chalice, and I guess just something has got to go. I'm not 100% that Solitude should be the cut, but it's also not, you know, they can grind a bit, and you might not be able to 2-for-1 yourself too many times with cards like Solitude. Yeah. I think the matchup gets a bit better again for you after sideboard, thanks to Endurance. You know, against Mel, what can you say? Be a bit aware of archive trap. Try to fetch as soon as possible. Also, be aware of their field of runes, so don't get your basics for no reason. And also keep track of what's left in your deck when you're fetching. Make sure you actually have lands left to fetch. Yeah. Yeah, I think that matchup's probably close. And then what do I have? I have the mirror. So obviously mirror Omnath decks have many shapes and forms. But in general, what I've been doing is boarding out my verdicts and boarding out a 5-mana Teferi because they might get more counter spells like Dispute or Veto. So your expensive Planeswalkers are a liability sometimes. And I just bring in the 2 Disputes and the 1 Fury. I also did bring in Endurance. I got paired against Canister in one of the challenges, and he was playing the Yorion version. 80 card was Ephemerate and Witness. And I actually brought in all the Endurance, so I think that sideboard guide is actually a little outdated. I'm trying to remember what I boarded out to make room for Endurance. I liked Endurance. It was an instance fee Fred in a matchup that becomes a bit more, a bit less tap outy and more about, you have more counters, you have more counters. So the Flash Fred is nice. It's also really good. It can be really good against Ren and Witness. If they have Ren and only 1 fetch and they plus and you Endurance the land, I think that can be a really big deal. So I brought in Endurance. I had the Disputes, I had the Fury. What did I cut? I might have trimmed 1 Prismatic Ending, and I might have trimmed Force of Negation because of Veils and Vetoes. And maybe I just cut another expensive Planeswalkers. But yeah, I think Endurance might actually be good in this matchup. Next, that was one of my losses over the weekend against Ragdos Lurrus. Tough matchup. They have 1 card that's super annoying against you. It's Torok, the 2-1 with Kicker that makes you discard cards, and that's pro-white. You almost have nothing to deal with a pro-white creature. You have Jade's Divine Sculpture, Verdict, and Fury, as well as Counterspell, obviously, but once it's in play, tough to deal with. And there, I think the easiest is just to board out all your counterspells. You don't really want Force of Negation, because the 2-for-1 is kind of rough, and keeping mana up can be tricky. Their spells are pretty cheap, so not a great deal. They also have discard spells, meaning that if they see your hand and they see you have a counter spell, they can kind of navigate around it. I'd rather have my proactive cards, so that's a matchup where I bring in all my Endurance. I bring in the 2nd Fury. I bring in Spreading Seas because they have demand lands, and they also have a Croxa, which is a scary card, or can be, and their mana is actually, it can be a little... You can disrupt them a bit with Spreading Seas. But yeah, just Den of the Bugbear can be a really annoying card to deal with. And of course, you bring in the 1 Purge. So yeah, that matchup looked really close. We played a fun match against Aspiring Spike where he won game 1, and then he punted game 2, and then I punted game 3. And it was both like kind of onboard punts. So we took turns throwing games. Last matchup I'm going to talk about, that's quite popular and strong, is Black Green Yawgmoth. I don't have much to say about the matchup. You have a lot of removal for their stuff. I think the matchup's okay. I think it runs pretty good against them. Keep in mind Veil of Summer after sideboard. And yeah, not too sure. So yeah, the sideboard guide there is you're actually, I was thinking just Fury and Purge. I think Spreading Seas, they have the triple black messenger, Geralt's Messenger, but I think that's a little too narrow. People bring up Endurance a lot. You're like, but Gab, Endurance to disrupt their combo. And I'm just like, in what world do you live where you're going to be in a spot where they're comboing off and you can afford to 2-for-1 yourself with Endurance just to get rid of 1 creature. It's not like, oh, they're like a glass cannon combo deck and if you get them with endurance, like against a deck like Living End, game just over. Game just over and just ends and it's over. They still have, it means they have other creatures in play. They have a Yawgmoth in play. They're just gonna beat you anyways. Potentially you could have. Potentially you could maybe get in a spot where you have the mana up and then you hardcast it and the body's kind of okay to block. So it's not awful, but it's not going to help you disrupt the combo. I don't think so. So yeah, I like to keep it simple. You could maybe do Chalice of the Void because they have a lot of 1-mana spells and they usually bring in Thoughtseize and Veil of Summer. The problem is they also bring in Reclamation Sage for said Chalice, so that one's kind of tricky. Yeah, as I said, maybe Chalice for more counter spells. Force of Negation against Veil of Summer is kind of scary. But yeah, I haven't that one quite figured out yet. But I think this is another slightly fairer matchup. Obviously, I'm a little biased. I've been winning with the deck a lot, so I feel like a lot of matchups are close, but probably slightly favored. Maybe I'm just outplaying my opponents. But yeah, I think the deck's really strong, really cool to play. Also really expensive. If you have, if you don't have all the Force of Negations, I don't think it's a big deal, but I think, at least a couple would be nice. If you only have 2 or 3 Wrenn and 6, I don't think that's a big deal. If you don't have any Wrenn and 6s at all, I would maybe recommend not playing that deck. I feel like Wrenn and 6 was just such an amazing card, super strong, but yeah. Just a cool deck. I want to talk about maybe the cards I would like to try. I was thinking about trying, maybe Lightning Bolt in the main deck. I was thinking about trying maybe a copy or 2 of Ephemerate. You don't want too many, I think, because you don't have all the targets that the other versions of Omnath do, but in the matchup specifically where Solitude is really good and when they're not going to mess too much with you, I think maybe 1 copy of Solitude could be a good ratio. One Ephemerate to your 4 Solitude. You also have Omnath later in the game. Because I feel like if you can get them in the early games with evoking Solitude and Ephemerate, that can just be super game-winning there. Other cards you can consider, Veil of Summer. You can consider Ether Gust. Add 1 copy of Ether Gust for a long time in the sideboard. I think that card's fine. Kind of your usual suspects. You can tweak your sideboard to your local meta. One thing I've found in general in Modern is that you don't need the sideboard slots as much as you used to. It used to be that you always wish you had 25 or 30 sideboard slots when you played a deck like Blue-White Control, because you needed your Stony Silence, your Rest in Peace, your Clicks, your cards for Control, your cards for Ramp, your cards for Tron, and you always had to pick and make sacrifices. Whereas now, you have so many versatile and powerful cards, cards like Prismatic Ending, Force of Negation, Solitude. These cards kind of answer everything, and the cards are just inherently more powerful that you don't need all these specific answers as badly. The elementals cover that really well. The endurance, just, I don't know if you noticed, but I'm basically bringing endurance in every matchup. Almost begs the question, should you have endurance in your main deck? What's that? I bring it against Murktide. I even bring in 1 copy against Hammer Time. I bring them all against Blue-White. I bring them all against Living End. I bring 1 or 2 copies against Burn, maybe. I bring them all against Mill. In the mirror, I bring them as well against Luris. Yeah, so literally every matchup you could argue endurance. The question is what you cut. So that's another something you could experiment with, maybe endurance in the main deck. But yeah, just in general, you've got so that's been kind of a blessing for these decks, just not struggling with the sideboard slots. But yeah, I think this is going to be it. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't done so yet, I'm assuming if you made it this far, you probably enjoyed the video. Make sure you leave me a like. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. Leave me a comment. Think what you think about, if you have questions about the deck, or you would sideboard differently in the matchup, or maybe different tweaks you've tried. Let me know in the comments. I'll have the sideboard guide in the description. Wow, that ran like 45 minutes, so let me know if, maybe you want me to try and keep it a little shorter, or just keep it to maybe a presentation of the deck and just a sideboard guide in the link. Let me know what you think of the video and the format in general, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.